Vignetting controls in Lightroom can be used for lens corrections or for creative effects that add emphasis and depth to your image. Let's start with vignetting controls found in the lens correction pane here. These controls will be used primarily when you want to compensate for a lens that has added an unwanted dark or light tint to the outer parameter of your image area. Negative amount settings, as I'm doing here, add darker values to the edge, and the positive amount settings lighten the edges. Move this back. The midpoint adjusts the position of the vignette. So when I move the midpoint into the lower values, the mount moves away from the corner to the middle. And when I move the midpoint to the right, to higher values, it restricts the adjustment to an area closer to the edge. So as long as you're working with an image that hasn't been cropped, these controls are fine. But what happens when you crop an image? I'll select the crop overlay tool, and let's crop this image down a little bit. And drop it down. So we have a cropped image. And when I go and apply the same settings, moving the amount to the left, which should be darkening the edges. Well, it is darkening the edges, but they're the outer edges, the uncropped edges. It doesn't even reach into the cropped area. So obviously this control is not going to work on the cropped images, which brings us to the post-crop vignetting tools found under the Effects menu here. So when I use the post-crop vignetting controls, I'll start with the amount. It's going to work the same way as up in the lens corrections pane. As I move to the negative values, it darkens the edges. But you see now it's starting from a new point of reference. It's starting from the cropped edge. And then you have the positive values lightening the edges. The midpoint works in much the same way as we described earlier. It describes the relationship of the vignetting to the edge. So now we get closer to the edge. I'm going to leave that right in the middle. So there's a couple other things that are new here to the post-cropping vignetting that we don't have in the lens cropping vignetting. So we can control the roundness. The lower values here are going to make it more oval shaped. And if I give a little more intensity and move my midpoint in, you can see the effect of that. And the positive values are going to give it more of a rounding vignette. I'm double-clicking on the triangle. That always brings any slider you're working on back to its default. And then for the feathering slider, which we also don't have in the lens correction pane, feathering, well, you can see, we can give it a hard edge with the values to the left and then soften the transition by moving the feathering to the right. Highlights, I'm going to come back to the highlight slider in a minute, but I want to show you something that's probably the most important aspect of the post-crop vignetting controls in Lightroom 3. In previous versions of Lightroom, we had vignette that basically used black and white pixels to paint, and the effect would be very similar to what under Style is called paint overlay. You can see the vignette is gray. It's not a very attractive vignette. It's not very realistic. What is new to Lightroom 3 are these two new settings, color priority and highlight priority. Now, these are only going to be available if you're using the new process version. And what I mean by that is you can see under settings here, process, I'm using the 2010, which is the current process version. If I was using the previous process version, 2003, these new post-crop vignetting styles would not be available. So under color priority, you can see, let me toggle back and forth. When I'm going from paint overlay, it's that gray vignette. And then the color priority, it's lightening and darkening the color values. It's a much more realistic looking vignette. So under the highlight priority, the difference between highlight and color is highlight priority is actually going in, and if there's any specular highlights that are clipped, in other words, where there's detail that's been lost, it'll go in and attempt to regain some detail in the highlights. You're not going to have quite as accurate color when you're using highlight priority over color priority. So I generally just leave it at color priority. Now, that brings up the slider I said I was going to talk about earlier, which is the highlight slider. And I'm going to show you how that works. I'm going to really give it a bumped up amount setting. Now, I'm going to move this slider to the right. And now you see how it's really controlling the vignette in the highlights and leaving the shadow area vignette alone. So it's a way of controlling the vignetting in just the highlight areas alone. A lot more control now with this post-crop vignetting tool. Much nicer, more natural-looking vignettes available through color priority and highlight priority, as long as you're using the new process version. And then, of course, you have the added control now of the highlights slider that we didn't have in earlier versions of Lightroom as well. So this is a great way to really add some depth to your photograph and draw the attention to the subject in the middle. I probably use the post-crop vignetting tool 90% of the time on my images, and I think you'll find that's fairly common among other professionals. It's just a great tool to use, and Lightroom 3 has just made it even better.